Rancher gave widow shelter in the storm. Her first story broke him. The thunder came first, rolling across the Texas plains like God's own wagon wheels over broken stone. Samuel McKenna heard it from inside his cabin, where he sat at the rough-hewn table with a plate of beans growing cold before him. He'd been staring at the empty chair across from him, Martha's chair, and listening to the silence that had lived in this place for 3 long years. The wind picked up next, rattling the shutters he'd built with his own hands back when he still believed in tomorrow. It howled through the gaps in the walls like something wild and hungry, searching for a way in. Samuel pushed back from the table and walked to the window, pressing his face against the glass that Martha had insisted on ordering from Dallas, back when she was still alive to insist on anything. The sky had turned the color of an old bruise, purple and black and angry. Lightning split it open like a knife through cloth, and for a moment the whole world went white and silent. Then the thunder followed, shaking the cabin down to its foundation stones. Samuel had seen storms before. Hell, he'd lived through the worst drought in 20 years, watched his cattle die one by one until there were more bones than beef left on his land. But this storm felt different. It felt like something breaking open, like the sky itself was crying for all the things that couldn't be fixed. The rain started gentle, just a whisper against the roof. Then it came harder, drumming like fingers on wood. Then harder still until it sounded like bullets hitting the earth. Samuel watched it through the window, watched it turn his dusty yard into a river of mud, and try not to think about how Martha used to love the rain. She would stand on the porch during storms like this one, her arms spread wide, letting the water soak through her dress until it clung to her like a second skin. "It's like the world is washing itself clean," she'd say, laughing when Samuel told her she'd catch her death. Sometimes a body needs to be washed clean too. But Martha was 3 years dead now, buried under the oak tree behind the house, and Samuel had forgotten what clean felt like. The knock came so soft at first that he thought it was just the storm playing tricks. Then it came again, firmer, more real. Samuel stood frozen by the window, his hand on the curtain. Nobody came to his ranch anymore. The nearest neighbor was 15 miles away, and the town was 23 miles of hard riding through country that could kill a man if he wasn't careful. The knock came a third time, and Samuel moved toward the door like a man walking through deep water. His hand found a rifle that leaned against the wall, fingers wrapping around the familiar wood. 3 years of solitude had made him careful, made him slow to trust. When he opened the door, the wind tried to tear it from his hands. Rain lashed across the porch, soaking his shirt in seconds. And there, standing in the storm like something born from the lightning itself, was a woman. She was dressed all in black, from the top of her bonnet to the hem of her dress that was heavy with water. Her face was pale as milk in the darkness, and her eyes, Lord, her eyes were the color of winter sky, gray and cold and full of something that looked like grief. She held a carpet bag in one hand, gripping it so tight her knuckles showed white through the skin. "Please," she said, and her voice was barely louder than the rain. "I need shelter." Samuel stared at her, this stranger woman standing on his porch in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of a storm that could wash a person away like they'd never existed at all. Every instinct he'd learned in 43 years of hard living told him to shut the door, to send her on her way, to protect what little he had left. But something in her face stopped him. Maybe it was the way she held herself, straight and proud, even soaked to the bone. Maybe it was the exhaustion that clung to her like dust, the kind of tiredness that came from carrying something too heavy for too long. Or maybe it was just that he recognized the look in her eyes, the same look he saw in his own reflection when he bothered to look in the mirror anymore. It was the look of someone who had lost everything that mattered. "Ma'am," he said finally, stepping back from the door, "you'd better come in before this storm tears you apart." She nodded once, quick and grateful, and stepped across his threshold. Water dripped from her dress onto Martha's clean floor, forming dark puddles that caught the firelight. Samuel closed the door behind her and turned the bolt, shutting out the storm, but not the feeling that something fundamental had just changed in his small, careful world. The woman stood in the center of his cabin, looking around with those winter sky eyes. She took in the empty plate on the table, the cold fireplace, the layer of dust that had settled over everything since he'd stopped caring about such things. Her gaze lingered on Martha's rocking chair in the corner, on the quilt folded over its back that still smelled faintly of lavender and hope. "I'm sorry to trouble you," she said, setting her carpet bag down by her feet. "The storm caught me on the road. I saw your light." Samuel nodded, not sure what to say. He'd forgotten how to talk to people, especially women, especially strangers who appeared out of storms like answers to prayers he'd never prayed. "You're bleeding," he said instead, noticing the dark stain on her sleeve. She looked down at her arm, surprised, as if she'd forgotten about the wound. "It's nothing. Just caught it on some wire." But Samuel could see it wasn't nothing. The cut was deep enough to need tending, and her face had gone paler, if that was possible. Without thinking, he moved toward her, then stopped himself. He didn't know this woman, didn't know her name, or where she'd come from, or what had brought her to his door in the middle of the worst storm he'd seen in years. "Sit," he said gruffly, pointing to the chair by the fire. "I'll get some bandages." She sat without argument, which told him more about how tired she was than words could have. Samuel busied himself building up the fire, adding wood until the flames caught and threw warm light across the room. Then he went to the chest where Martha had kept her medicines and pulled out clean cloth and a bottle of whiskey. When he turned back, the woman was staring into the fire like she could see something there that he couldn't. Her wet hair had come loose from her bonnet, falling in dark waves around her shoulders. In the firelight, she looked younger than he'd first thought, maybe 30 or so, though her eyes held the weight of someone much older. "What's your name?" Samuel asked, kneeling beside her chair with the bandages in his hands. She was quiet for so long that he thought she might not answer. Then she turned those gray eyes to his, and he saw something flicker there. Fear, maybe, or shame. "Mary Catherine Walsh," she said softly. "And I'm grateful for your kindness, Mr. McKenna." Samuel McKenna. He began cleaning her wound, working by the light of the fire, trying not to notice how his hands shook when they touched her skin. "Mrs. Walsh." "Just Mary Catherine," she said. "There's no need for titles between strangers in a storm." Samuel wrapped the bandage around her arm, his fingers careful and gentle. It had been 3 years since he'd touched another human being with tenderness, and the feeling nearly undid him. When he was finished, he sat back on his heels and looked at her properly for the first time. She was beautiful, he realized with a start. Not in the bright, laughing way that Martha had been beautiful, but in a quieter, sadder way that made his chest ache. There was sorrow written in every line of her face, in the way she held her shoulders, in the careful distance she kept between herself and the world. "The storm should pass by morning," Samuel said, standing and putting distance between them. "You can rest here tonight. Take the bed. I'll sleep by the fire." Mary Catherine shook her head. "I couldn't take your bed. The chair is fine." "No," Samuel said, more firmly than he'd intended. "The bed." She looked like she might argue, then seemed to think better of it. Instead, she nodded and said, "Thank you. You're very kind." Kind. The word sat strangely in Samuel's mind. He hadn't thought of himself as kind in a long time. Hadn't thought of himself as much of anything, really, except a man waiting to die on land that no longer wanted him. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, something had shifted. The silence felt different now, less empty somehow. Samuel poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot that always sat on the stove and settled into Martha's rocking chair, watching the fire dance in the grate. Mary Catherine sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap, her wet dress slowly drying in the heat. Neither of them spoke, but the quiet between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that came when two people recognized something in each other, some shared understanding that didn't need words. The thunder rolled overhead, shaking the cabin, and Samuel found himself wondering what had brought this woman to his door. What kind of trouble had she been running from, or toward? What secrets lived behind those winter sky eyes? But he didn't ask. In the morning, she would go on her way, and he would be alone again with his ghosts and his grief. For tonight, it was enough that the storm had brought him a stranger, someone to share the darkness with, someone whose pain might be deep enough to match his own. The fire crackled, and the rain kept falling, and Samuel McKenna sat in his dead wife's chair, watching a woman named Mary Catherine Walsh and wondering what tomorrow's light might bring to his door. The coffee had grown cold in Samuel's hands by the time Mary Catherine began to speak. He'd been watching her for near an hour, the way she sat so still in Martha's old chair, her fingers tracing patterns on her wet skirt that only she could see. The fire had burned down to embers, casting more shadows than light across her face, making her look like something carved from sorrow itself. Outside, the storm had settled into a steady rhythm, rain against glass, wind through the eaves. It was the kind of night that made a person want to tell stories, to fill the darkness with words instead of silence. But Mary Catherine had been quiet as stone, and Samuel hadn't pushed. He knew something about the weight of secrets, about how they could press down on a soul until breathing became work. "I had a husband once," she said suddenly, her voice so soft he had to lean forward to catch the words. "Thomas Walsh. Good man, everyone said. Went to church every Sunday, tipped his hat to the ladies, paid his debts on time." Samuel nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He could hear something beneath her words, something sharp and broken that made his chest tighten. Mary Catherine lifted her head then, looking not at him but at the dying fire. The light caught her eyes, and he saw they weren't just gray. There were flecks of blue in them, like pieces of sky scattered through winter clouds. But there was something else there too, something that made him think of trapped animals and dark corners. "We lived in a little house outside of Amarillo," she continued, her hands still now, folded tight in her lap. "Thomas worked at the bank. I kept house, tended a garden. From the outside, we looked like any married couple. Happy even." She paused, and Samuel heard her swallow hard, like she was choking down something bitter. The wind rattled the shutters, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the plains like wagon wheels over stone. "But Thomas had a temper," Mary Catherine said, and her voice was different now, smaller somehow. "When he drank, which was most nights, he got mean. Started with words. Called me stupid, worthless, said I was lucky any man would have me at all." Samuel's coffee cup creaked in his grip, and he realized his hands had clenched into fists. He knew men like Thomas Walsh, had seen what they could do to the people who were supposed to love them. Martha had never suffered such treatment. Samuel would have died first, but he'd seen the bruises on other women, heard the excuses whispered in church pews. "Then it got worse," Mary Catherine whispered. "The words became hands. Hands became fists. I learned to cover the marks, learned to smile when people asked about the accidents. So many accidents, they said. Poor Mary Catherine, so clumsy." She laughed then, but it was the sound of something breaking. Samuel wanted to reach for her, to offer some comfort, but he stayed in his chair. Some pain was too deep for touching, too raw for comfort from strangers. "I thought about leaving," she said. "Thought about it every day for 3 years. But where does a woman go? I had no family, no money of my own. Thomas made sure of that. He'd tell me I was nothing without him, that I'd starve in the street if I tried to make it alone." The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney, and Mary Catherine flinched like she'd been struck. Samuel saw her hand go to her throat, an unconscious gesture that told him more than her words ever could. "The night it happened," she said, her voice barely a whisper now. "Thomas came home later than usual. Drunk or two. I was in the kitchen, cleaning up after supper, trying to stay quiet. But he found me anyway. He always found me." Samuel's chest felt tight, like someone had wrapped rope around his ribs and pulled. He wanted to tell her to stop, that she didn't need to relive whatever came next. But he could see in her face that the words were coming whether he wanted to hear them or not, like water through a broken dam. "He hit me harder that night," Mary Catherine said, her fingers touching her cheek as if the bruise was still fresh. "Knocked me down, started kicking. Said I'd burned his dinner, though I hadn't. Said I was looking at other men in church, though I kept my eyes on my hands. He always found reasons. Thunder crashed overhead, so loud it shook the cabin walls. Mary Catherine started, her whole body going rigid, and Samuel saw her transported back to that night, to that kitchen, to the moment when everything changed. He grabbed me by the hair, she said, her voice flat now, empty of everything but memory. Dragged me to my feet. Started choking me with his hands around my throat. I couldn't breathe, couldn't see. The whole world was going black. Samuel's own hands went to his throat without thinking. He could imagine it too clearly, could see this gentle woman fighting for air, fighting for her life. There was a knife on the counter, Mary Catherine said. The one I'd been using to cut vegetables. I reached for it without thinking, just trying to make him stop, just trying to breathe. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm outside. Samuel watched her face, saw the moment when she would have to say the words that had been eating her alive for however long she'd been carrying them. I stabbed him, she whispered, right in the chest. He looked so surprised, like he couldn't believe what was happening. He let go of my throat and stepped back, looking down at the knife handle sticking out of his shirt. Then he fell down and didn't get up again. The words hung between them like smoke, thick and choking. Samuel felt his own breath catch, not from shock but from recognition. He understood now why she'd appeared at his door, like something conjured from the storm. She was running, not from the law necessarily, but from herself, from the weight of what she'd done, even if she'd had no choice. I didn't mean to kill him, Mary Catherine said, tears finally coming, sliding down her cheeks like rain on glass. I just wanted him to stop hurting me. I just wanted to breathe. Samuel set his coffee cup aside and leaned forward in his chair. Did you tell anyone what really happened? She shook her head. I told the sheriff it was an accident. Said Thomas had been drinking and fell on the knife. The sheriff knew what kind of man Thomas was, had heard the stories. He didn't ask too many questions. So why are you running? Mary Catherine looked at him then, really looked at him, and Samuel saw the full depth of her pain. It was like staring into a well at midnight, so deep and dark he couldn't see the bottom. Because I'm not sorry, she said simply. I should feel guilty, should mourn him, should regret what I did. But when I think about that night, about the knife going into his chest, all I feel is relief. And that makes me a murderer, doesn't it? Not in the eyes of the law, maybe, but in the eyes of God. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, watching the fire burn lower. He thought about Martha, about how gentle she'd been, how she'd never raised her voice, let alone her hand. He tried to imagine someone hurting her the way Thomas had hurt Mary Catherine, and the rage that rose in his chest was swift and hot. You're not a murderer, he said finally. You're a woman who fought to live. Mary Catherine shook her head. You don't understand. I've been thinking about that night every day since it happened. And sometimes, in my worst moments, I'm glad he's dead. I'm glad I'll never have to feel his hands around my throat again. Never have to wonder if tonight's the night he finally kills me. What kind of person thinks such things? The kind who's been hurt too much for too long, Samuel said quietly. The kind who knows the difference between killing and defending your own life. But Mary Catherine wasn't listening. She was staring into the fire again, lost in memories that would never leave her alone. I left town the next morning, she said. Packed everything I could carry and started walking. Been walking for 3 weeks now. Don't know where I'm going. Just know I can't stay in one place too long. People ask too many questions. Samuel watched her wipe tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand. There was something fierce in her face now, something that reminded him of wild horses he'd seen, beautiful and broken but not defeated. She'd killed a man who was trying to kill her, and she was carrying that weight like it was her sin to bear instead of his. The worst part, Mary Catherine said, her voice getting stronger, is that I can still feel his hand sometimes. When I'm trying to sleep, I wake up gasping, thinking he's there. Thinking he's found me somehow. And I know that's impossible. Know he's buried in the ground back in Amarillo, but I can't make my body believe it. Thunder rolled overhead again, and this time she didn't flinch. She sat straighter in her chair, like telling the truth had taken some weight off her shoulders, even if it couldn't take it all away. Why are you telling me this? Samuel asked gently. Mary Catherine smiled then, sad and tired but real. "Because you have kind eyes," she said, "and because I haven't spoken his name to another living soul since the night I killed him. I thought maybe if I said it out loud, if someone else knew the truth, it might stop eating me alive from the inside." Samuel nodded, understanding more than she knew. He had his own secrets, his own weight to carry. Maybe that was why the storm had brought her here, to this cabin where silence lived like another person, where grief sat at the table every night. "Does it help?" he asked, saying it out loud. Mary Catherine considered this, tilting her head like she was listening to something only she could hear. Outside, the storm was beginning to ease, the rain gentler now, the thunder moving off toward the east. "I don't know yet," she said honestly, "but it doesn't hurt any worse than keeping it inside. And maybe that's something." Samuel watched her face in the dying firelight and saw something there that hadn't been there before. Not peace, exactly, but maybe the possibility of peace somewhere down the road. She'd spoken her truth into the darkness, and the world hadn't ended. The cabin was still standing, the fire was still burning, and both of them were still breathing. But he could see the exhaustion in her shoulders now, the way the telling had drained something vital from her. The storm outside was quieting, but the storm inside her was far from over, and Samuel found himself wondering what morning light might bring to both of them. Samuel woke to silence, so complete it hurt his ears. The storm had passed sometime in the deep hours of night, leaving behind a world washed clean and still as death. Gray light filtered through the windows, the kind of dawn that came after violence, soft and apologetic like the sky was sorry for all the rage it had shown the night before. He lay on the floor by the cold fireplace, his back stiff from sleeping on hardwood, and listened to the quiet breathing coming from his bedroom. Mary Catherine, the woman who had killed her husband and told him about it by firelight, whose confession still hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Samuel should have ridden to town hours ago, should have saddled his horse in the dark and brought back Sheriff Morrison to take her away in chains. That was what law-abiding men did when murderers appeared at their doors. That was what Martha would have expected him to do, back when Martha was alive to expect anything. But Samuel found himself thinking about Mary Catherine's hands as she'd told her story. How they'd shaken when she spoke about Thomas choking her. How they'd gone still as stone when she'd said the words, "I stabbed him." Those weren't the hands of killer. They were the hands of someone who'd been drowning and had grabbed onto whatever she could find to stay alive. He pulled himself up from the floor, joints creaking like old fence posts, and looked toward the bedroom door. It was still closed, though he could see a sliver of pale morning light beneath it. She was probably awake. He doubted she slept much these days, carrying what she carried. Samuel walked to the window and looked out at his land. The rain had turned everything green overnight, like someone had painted the world with life while he wasn't looking. His vegetable garden, which had been nothing but dust and dead stalks yesterday, now showed tiny shoots of green pushing up through the mud. Martha's flowers, the ones he'd stopped tending 3 years ago, were blooming wild and bright beside the porch. It should have made him happy, this sudden resurrection of growing things. Instead, it made his chest ache with loneliness, so sharp it took his breath away. Martha would have been on the porch already, barefoot in her nightgown, marveling at what the storm had brought. She would have called him outside to see, would have danced in the wet grass like a child. "It's beautiful," a soft voice said behind him. Samuel turned to see Mary Catherine standing in the bedroom doorway. She'd changed out of her wet black dress into one of Martha's old gowns, a simple blue cotton thing that had always been too small for his wife, but fit Mary Catherine like it was made for her. She'd braided her dark hair back from her face, and in the morning light, she looked younger somehow, less haunted. "Martha's dress," Samuel said, the words coming out rougher than he'd intended. Mary Catherine looked down at herself, her face flushing red. "I'm sorry. My dress was still wet and I was cold. I shouldn't have—" "No," Samuel said quickly. "It's fine. She would have wanted. She wouldn't have minded." Mary Catherine nodded, but she wrapped her arms around herself like she was still cold. They stood in the gray morning light, two people who barely knew each other's names, but it shared something in the darkness that couldn't be taken back. "The storm's over," Mary Catherine said, though they could both see that plain enough. "Appears so. I should go." Samuel looked at her, this woman who'd appeared at his door, like an answer to a question he hadn't known he was asking. She should go. He knew that. She had blood on her hands and secrets in her heart, and keeping her here was like harboring a wounded wolf, beautiful and dangerous and likely to bring trouble to his door. But when he opened his mouth to agree, different words came out. "Coffee's on the stove," he said. "If you want some." Something flickered in Mary Catherine's eyes. Surprise, maybe, or relief. She nodded and walked to the kitchen, moving carefully around his space like she was afraid of disturbing something sacred. Samuel watched her pour coffee into 2 cups, her movements sure and graceful despite the tremor he could see in her hands. She held out 1 cup to him, and when he took it, their fingers brushed. Her skin was warm, alive, real as anything he'd ever touched. It had been 3 years since he'd felt another person's warmth, and the contact sent something like electricity up his arm. "Thank you," Mary Catherine said, settling into the chair by the window. "For the coffee. For last night. For not turning me away." Samuel sat across from her, in Martha's rocking chair, and tried not to think about how right it felt to have someone at his table again. "Where will you go?" he asked. Mary Catherine shrugged, looking out at the green world beyond the glass. "West, I suppose. California, maybe. I hear it's easy to disappear there, to start over with a new name. Long way to California. Long way from Texas, too. That's the point." Samuel sipped his coffee and studied her face. In the daylight, he could see the faint yellow of an old bruise along her jaw, mostly healed but still visible if you knew how to look. There were others, too, he suspected. Marks that Thomas Walsh had left on her that would take longer than 3 weeks to fade. "You ever think about staying somewhere?" Samuel asked. Instead of running, Mary Catherine's cup stopped halfway to her lips. "What do you mean?" Samuel wasn't sure what he meant. The words had come out of their own accord, like his mouth was working without consulting his brain. "Just seems like a hard way to live," he said finally. "Always looking over your shoulder. Never staying long enough to call a place home." "I don't deserve a home," Mary Catherine said quietly. "Not after what I did." "What you did was survive." She shook her head. "What I did was kill a man. My husband. Whatever his faults, however he treated me, that's still what I did." Samuel set his coffee cup down with a sharp clink. "His faults." The words came out harder than he'd intended. "Mary Catherine, the man was killing you. Slowly, maybe, but surely. What you did wasn't murder. It was justice." Tears gathered in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. "You don't understand. I think about that night, and I'm not sorry. I should be sorry, should feel guilty, should spend the rest of my life atoning for what I took from the world. But all I feel is glad he can't hurt me anymore. And that makes me just as bad as him." "No," Samuel said, leaning forward in his chair. "That makes you human." They sat in silence for a while, drinking coffee and watching the world wake up outside. Samuel found himself studying Mary Catherine's face, the way the light caught in her gray eyes, the gentle curve of her mouth when she wasn't thinking about sad things. She was beautiful, but more than that, she was strong. She'd survived 3 years of hell and then found the courage to save herself when saving was the only choice left. "Tell me about Martha," Mary Catherine said suddenly. Samuel's hand tightened on his coffee cup. "What?" "Your wife. Martha. Tell me about her." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, trying to decide if he wanted to open that door. He'd spent 3 years keeping Martha's memory locked away, afraid that talking about her would make the missing worse somehow. But looking at Mary Catherine, seeing the genuine interest in her eyes, he found the words coming easier than they had in years. "She laughed like music," he said softly. "Could make anything grow, even in drought years. Used to say the plants could hear her singing to them." He smiled, surprising himself. "She was always dirty, always had soil under her fingernails from working in that garden. I used to tease her about it. She sounds wonderful. She was." Samuel's smile faded. "She died giving birth to our son. Both of them did. I came home from town and found her, found them both in our bed. She'd been alone. I should have been there. Mary Catherine's face went soft with understanding. Oh, Samuel. I buried them under the oak tree out back. Haven't been able to tend her garden since. Haven't been able to do much of anything, really. Just been sitting here for 3 years, waiting to die. Mary Catherine was quiet for a moment, then said, "She wouldn't want that for you." Samuel laughed, but there was no humor in it. "How do you know what she'd want?" "Because I know what it's like to love someone," Mary Catherine said quietly. "Before Thomas became what he became, there was a time when he was gentle, when he loved me, or at least I thought he did. And even after everything, even after what he did to me, I wouldn't want him to spend his life dying slowly from grief." Samuel looked at her, this woman who'd killed her husband and felt guilty for not being sorry, and saw something in her face that he recognized. It was the look of someone who understood loss, who knew what it meant to carry the weight of the dead. "Guilt's a poison," Mary Catherine said, wrapping both hands around her coffee cup like she was trying to warm something deeper than her fingers. "It eats you from the inside until there's nothing left but the hurting. I know because I've been poisoning myself for 3 weeks, and you've been doing it for 3 years." "It's not the same thing," Samuel said. "Isn't it? You think you should have saved her. I think I should feel sorry for killing Thomas. We're both carrying blame for things we couldn't control." Samuel wanted to argue, wanted to tell her that his grief was different, that losing Martha and their son wasn't the same as defending yourself against a violent man. But looking at Mary Catherine's face, seeing the pain there that matched his own, he couldn't find the words to make that argument. Instead, he said, "What do we do about it?" Mary Catherine smiled then, sad but real. "I don't know, but maybe we figure it out together." Outside, the sun was climbing higher, burning off the gray of dawn and turning the world gold and green. Samuel's land looked different in this light, alive and possible in ways it hadn't been yesterday. His coffee was growing cold, but he didn't mind. For the first time in 3 years, he wasn't drinking alone. Mary Catherine stood and walked to the window, looking out at the garden that was blooming wild and untended. "Would you show me where she's buried?" she asked quietly. "I'd like to pay my respects." Samuel nodded, though his throat felt tight. He hadn't been to Martha's grave since the day he'd put her in the ground. Couldn't bear to see her name on the stone. Couldn't stand the silence of the place where she should have been laughing. But maybe, he thought, watching Mary Catherine touch the window glass like she was blessing the view beyond, maybe it was time to remember that some things were worth the hurting. Maybe it was time to stop running from the dead and start learning to carry them with him instead of being buried beneath their weight. "After breakfast," he said, and Mary Catherine turned to smile at him. And Samuel felt something shift in his chest, something that had been frozen for 3 long years beginning, finally, to thaw. 3 days passed like water through cupped hands, slow and precious, and gone too soon. Samuel hadn't meant for Mary Catherine to stay, hadn't planned on a way she moved through his house like she belonged there, quiet and careful, but undeniably present. She slept in Martha's bed and wore Martha's dresses, and somehow made both things feel right instead of wrong. On the first morning, he'd found her in the garden before dawn, kneeling in the mud with her hands deep in the earth. She'd pulled weeds from around Martha's roses, coaxed life back into the vegetable rows that had been dead for 3 years. When he'd asked her why, she'd looked up at him with dirt on her cheek and said, "Things shouldn't die just because nobody's watching them grow." Samuel had stood on the porch with his coffee growing cold, watching her work. There was something almost holy in the way she touched the plants, gentle but sure, like she was apologizing to them for being neglected so long. Her hands were small and pale, but they knew what they were doing. They knew how to heal things that had been broken. The second day, she'd swept out corners that hadn't seen a broom in years, washed windows until they let in light he'd forgotten existed. She didn't ask permission for any of it, didn't make a fuss or act like she was doing him favors. She just worked, quiet and steady, like she was trying to pay back some debt that only she could see. Samuel found himself watching her more than he should have. The way she hummed softly while she worked, songs he didn't recognize that sounded like prayers. The way she paused sometimes to look out the window, like she was checking to make sure the world was still there. The way she folded his shirts with the same care she'd shown Martha's quilt. Like every small task was a chance to do something right. By the third morning, the house felt different. Not like it had when Martha was alive. That particular kind of happiness couldn't be recreated. But it felt lived in again, cared for, like a place where people might actually want to stay instead of just waiting to die. Samuel was sitting on the porch, watching Mary Catherine tend the tomato plants. We saw the dust cloud on the horizon. A single rider coming fast across the plains, raising a trail behind him like smoke from a grass fire. Samuel's chest tightened as he recognized the bay horse and the silver star glinting on the rider's vest. Sheriff Morrison. Samuel set his coffee cup down with hands that had started to shake. He'd known this moment would come, had been dreading it since the morning after the storm. Someone in town must have seen Mary Catherine on the road, must have asked questions that led to more questions. In a place like Clearwater, strangers didn't stay strangers long. Mary Catherine looked up from the garden and saw his face. She followed his gaze to the approaching rider and went very still, her hands frozen on the tomato vines. For a moment, Samuel thought she might run. He wouldn't have blamed her if she had. Instead, she stood slowly, wiping her hands on her apron, Martha's apron, and walked toward the porch. "That's the sheriff," she said quietly. Samuel nodded. "Jim Morrison. Known him 20 years. What will you tell him?" Samuel looked at her, standing there in the morning light, dirt under her fingernails and hope dying in her eyes. 3 days ago, she'd been a stranger who'd killed her husband and felt guilty for not being sorry. Now she was something else entirely, something he didn't have words for, but knew he couldn't bear to lose. "I don't know," he said honestly. Sheriff Morrison rode into the yard like he owned it, which in some ways he did. The law had long arms in Texas, and Jim Morrison had been enforcing it longer than most men had been breathing. He was 50-something with gray in his beard and lines around his eyes that came from squinting into too many sunrises, looking for trouble on the horizon. "Morning, Sam," he said, tipping his hat but not dismounting. His eyes went to Mary Catherine, took in her borrowed dress and the way she stood close to Samuel's porch like she was seeking shelter. "Ma'am." "Sheriff," Samuel said, standing slowly. His heart was hammering against his ribs, but his voice came out steady. "What brings you out this way?" Morrison shifted in his saddle, leather creaking. "Had word from Amarillo about a week ago. They're looking for a woman named Mary Catherine Walsh. Seems her husband died under suspicious circumstances, and she disappeared the next day. Thought you might have seen someone matching her description." Samuel felt Mary Catherine go rigid beside him. He could smell her fear, sharp and acid in the morning air. But when he looked at her, she wasn't running. She was standing straight, chin up, ready to face whatever came next. And something in that courage, that quiet dignity, made his decision for him. "What's she supposed to look like?" Samuel asked. Morrison pulled a piece of paper from his vest pocket. About 30 years old, dark hair, gray eyes. Traveling with a carpet bag. Pretty woman, by all accounts. Samuel nodded thoughtfully, like he was considering this information. "Can't say I've seen anyone like that. Been pretty quiet out here since the storm." The lie came out smooth as silk, surprising Samuel with how easy it was. He'd never been much for dishonesty, had always believed that truth was the backbone of an honorable man. But looking at Mary Catherine, seeing the way she'd brought his dead house back to life, he realized that sometimes honor looked different than he'd thought. Morrison's eyes narrowed slightly. "You sure about that, Sam?" Mrs. Walsh was last seen heading west on the main road. "Would have passed right by your place if she was coming this way." "I'm sure," Samuel said, meeting the sheriff's gaze without flinching. "Haven't seen hide nor hair of any strangers." Mary Catherine made a small sound beside him, barely a breath, but Samuel heard it. He wondered if she was surprised by his lie, if she'd expected him to hand her over to the law like any decent citizen should. But when he glanced at her, she wasn't looking at him at all. She was looking at Sheriff Morrison with something that might have been gratitude or might have been sorrow. Maybe both. Morrison studied them for a long moment, his lawman's instincts clearly telling him something wasn't right. But Samuel had lived on this land for 15 years, had never given the sheriff cause for suspicion, had buried his wife and son, and minded his own business like a man should. "Well," Morrison said finally, settling back in his saddle, "if you do see anything at all, you let me know. This woman might be dangerous." Her husband was a respected man in Amarillo, worked at the bank. His death was violent. Samuel nodded. Of course. Always happy to help the law. Morrison tipped his hat again and turned his horse toward the road. But before he rode away, he called back over his shoulder, "Nice to see someone's been taking care of Martha's garden. Looks better than it has in years." Then he was gone, leaving nothing but dust and the weight of what Samuel had just done hanging in the morning air. Mary Catherine sank down on the porch steps like her legs wouldn't hold her anymore. She put her face in her hands and took deep, shaking breaths that sounded like she was trying not to cry. "Why?" she asked without looking up. "Why did you lie for me?" Samuel sat down beside her, close enough to feel the warmth of her shoulder through Martha's blue dress. "Because," he said slowly, "3 days ago you told me you felt guilty for not being sorry you killed a man who was trying to kill you. And that's not guilt. That's survival." Mary Catherine lifted her head and looked at him with those gray eyes that had seen too much. "But I'm a murderer. I killed my husband." "No," Samuel said firmly. "You're a woman who fought to live. There's a difference, even if the law doesn't always see it." They sat in silence for a while, watching the dust settle where Morrison's horse had been. The garden stretched out before them, green and alive and full of promise. Martha's roses were blooming, red as blood but beautiful, and the tomatoes were heavy on their vines. "I should go," Mary Catherine said finally. "If I stay, you'll be in trouble too. Harboring a fugitive, lying to a sheriff. You've done enough for me." Samuel looked at her, this woman who'd appeared in a storm and brought his dead house back to life, and felt his heart clench like a fist in his chest. "Where will you go?" "California, like I planned. Maybe Oregon. Somewhere far enough away that the past can't follow." "And then what?" "You'll spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder." Mary Catherine shrugged, trying to look like it didn't matter. "I'll manage. I've gotten good at being alone." But Samuel could hear the loneliness in her voice, the resignation of someone who'd accepted that happiness wasn't meant for people like her. He thought about the last 3 days, how right it had felt to have her here, how the silence in his house had become companionable instead of crushing. "You don't have to be alone," he said quietly. Mary Catherine turned to look at him, something fragile and dangerous blooming in her eyes. "Samuel, I know it's crazy," he said quickly, before he could lose his nerve. "I know we barely know each other, know this whole thing is impossible. But these 3 days, they've been the first good days I've had in 3 years. And if you want to stay, I'll protect you. I'll keep you safe." Mary Catherine was quiet for a long moment, and Samuel could see her thinking, weighing the risk against the possibility of peace. Finally, she shook her head. "I can't ask you to do that. Can't ask you to build your life around keeping my secret. You deserve better than that." Samuel reached out and took her hand, felt her fingers cold and small in his. "What I deserve," he said, "is to stop dying slowly from grief. What I deserve is to remember what it feels like to have something to live for. You gave me that. These 3 days, you gave me that." Mary Catherine looked at their joined hands, then up at his face. "What if someone else comes looking? What if they don't believe your lies? Then we'll figure out when it happens. But Mary Catherine, I can't let you walk away from this. I can't let you disappear into the world thinking you don't deserve to be happy." For a moment, Samuel thought she might say yes. He could see her wanting to, could see the hope fighting with the fear in her eyes. But then she pulled her hand away and stood up, smoothing Martha's dress down over her legs. "I'll leave tomorrow morning," she said. "Early, before the sun's up. That way if anyone asks, you can honestly say you don't know where I went." Samuel wanted to argue, wanted to grab her hands and beg her to stay. But he could see the decision was made, could see it in the set of her shoulders and the way she wouldn't meet his eyes. She was going to disappear again, going to walk back into the world, carrying her guilt and her secrets, and there was nothing he could do to stop her. That night, they sat by the fire like they had on the night of the storm. But this time, The silence between them was full of things they couldn't say, full of possibilities that would die with the dawn. Mary Catherine had packed her carpet bag and set it by the door, ready for another journey into the unknown. "Thank you," she said as the fire burned low. "For everything. For the shelter, for the kindness, for the lie. I'll never forget it." Samuel nodded, not trusting his voice. He wanted to tell her that 3 days wasn't enough, that he'd finally remembered what it felt like to be alive, and he couldn't bear to go back to just existing. But he could see in her face that her mind was made up, that she'd convinced herself this was the only way to keep them both safe. When morning came, gray and soft with mist, Mary Catherine was gone. She'd left before dawn like she'd promised, disappeared into the world like smoke from a dying fire. The only trace of her was Martha's blue dress folded neat on the bed, and the garden blooming wild and beautiful in the early light. Samuel stood on his porch with his coffee growing cold, looking out at the land that felt empty again, but somehow different than it had before. He lied to a sheriff for a woman whose real name he barely knew, had offered her shelter and protection and maybe something more. She'd turned him down to keep him safe, had walked away from the first peace she'd known in years to protect a man who'd shown her kindness when she needed it most. Maybe that was love, Samuel thought, watching the sun climb over his green and growing land. Maybe love was knowing when to let someone go, even when it broke your heart to do it. Maybe mercy sometimes looked like lies, and sometimes the greatest truth was knowing when to stay silent. The morning light spread across his garden, touching the roses and the tomatoes and the small miracle of growing things, and Samuel McKenna stood on his porch and remembered, for the first time in 3 years, what it felt like to hope.